dense forest event. Tako was shrouded in a thick, eerie mist that evening, casting an otherworldly glow over the landscape. Tall, ancient trees loomed overhead, their gnarled branches twisting and turning like skeletal fingers reaching out from the darkness. The air was cold and damp, filled with the scent of wet leaves and earth, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the foliage as the wind whispered through the trees. Two friends, Yuto and Mari, made their way up the narrow, winding path that led to the summit. Yuto, a university student with a passion for urban legends, had convinced Mari to accompany him on this nocturnal adventure. Mari, though reluctant, was curious about the tales that surrounded this particular mountain. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Yuto?" Mari asked, her voice trembling slightly. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her bones. "Of course," Yuto replied with a grin, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Besides, it's just a story, right? The Hookman isn't real." Mari glanced around nervously, her eyes straining to see beyond the shadows. The legend of the Hookman was one of Tokyo's most famous urban legends. It told of a man with a hook for a hand who haunted remote areas and preyed on unsuspecting travelers. According to the tale, the Hookman was once a fisherman who had lost his hand in a gruesome accident and replaced it with a sharp metal hook. Filled with rage and resentment, he became a vengeful spirit, seeking revenge on anyone who crossed his path. As they continued their ascent, the forest grew darker and more foreboding. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the path became increasingly difficult to navigate. Yuto's flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging them into complete darkness. "Damn, the batteries are dead," Yuto muttered, shaking the flashlight in frustration. Mari felt a surge of panic. "Great, now what do we do?" "Don't worry," Yuto said, trying to sound reassuring. "I have a spare set in my bag. Just give me a minute." He fumbled with his backpack, trying to find the batteries. Mari stood close by, her eyes darting around the forest, every rustle and snap of a twig sending a shiver down her spine. Just as Yuto found the batteries and replaced them, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. A distant, metallic scraping noise echoed through the trees, growing louder and more distinct with each passing moment. Mari grabbed Yuto's arm, her grip tight with fear. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yuto nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I heard it." They stood frozen, listening as the sound grew closer. It was unmistakable, a sound of metal scraping against metal, like a hook being dragged along the ground. Yuto's mind raced. Could it really be the Hookman? Had their curiosity led them into a deadly trap? He shook his head, trying to dispel the fear. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the dread gnawing at his insides. They quickened their pace, moving as quietly as possible. The path ahead was shrouded in darkness, but Yuto's flashlight provided a small pool of light that guided their steps. The scraping sound continued to follow them, relentless and unyielding. Mari glanced back over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. In the dim light, she thought she saw a shadowy figure moving through the trees, but it was gone before she could be sure. "Yuto, I think someone's following us," she said, her voice trembling. Yuto nodded, his jaws set in determination. "We need to find a place to hide." They scanned the area, looking for any place that might offer shelter. Up ahead, they spotted a small, abandoned shrine, its wooden structure barely visible through the overgrown foliage. "This way," Yuto whispered, leading Mari towards the shrine. They reached the shrine and ducked inside, crouching low and trying to make themselves as small as possible. The scraping sound grew louder, now accompanied by the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Yuto turned off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness once more. They held their breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside the shrine, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, the sound of metal scraping against wood filled the air. and they knew the Hookman was close. Mary clung to Yutu, her eyes wide with terror. Yutu held her tightly, trying to think of a plan. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but making a run for it seemed just as dangerous. The scraping sound continued, slow and deliberate, as if the Hookman was savoring the hunt. Yutu's mind raced, searching for any possible escape route. Just as he was about to suggest making a break for it, the scraping stopped. The sudden silence was almost more terrifying than the noise. They waited, hearts pounding, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, Yutu dared to peek out from their hiding place. The path was empty, the forest silent once more. "I think he's gone," Yutu whispered, his voice barely audible. Mary nodded, relief flooding through her. They cautiously stepped out of the shrine, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. "We need to get out of here," Mary said, her voice shaky. Yutu nodded in agreement. "Let's head back down the mountain. We should be safe once we reach the main road." They moved quickly, but cautiously, making their way back down the path they had come. The forest was still and silent, the only sound their footsteps on the gravel. As they descended, the mist began to thin, and the trees seemed less menacing. Finally, they reached the main road, and the sight of streetlights in the distance filled them with relief. They quickened their pace, eager to leave the dark, haunted forest behind. Just as they thought they were safe, they heard the sound again, the unmistakable scraping of metal on metal. They froze, their hearts pounding with fear. From the shadows, a figure emerged. The Hookman stood before them, his hook glinting in the dim light. His eyes burned with a cold, vengeful fury. Yutu and Mary backed away, their minds racing with fear and desperation. The Hookman took a step forward, his hook raised menacingly. "Run!" Yutu shouted, grabbing Mary's hand. They turned and fled, their feet pounding the pavement as they sprinted towards the safety of the city lights. The Hookman followed, his footsteps echoing in the night. Yutu glanced back, his heart sinking as he saw the distance between them shrinking. They had to find help, or they would be caught. Up ahead, they saw a small convenience store, its lights bright and inviting. "Head for the store," Yutu shouted. They burst through the doors, startling the cashier. "Help us," Yutu gasped, his chest heaving. The cashier looked at them, bewildered. "What's going on?" "There's a man. He's trying to kill us," Mary panted. The cashier's eyes widened in shock. "Stay here," he said, reaching for the phone. Yutu and Mary huddled together, their eyes fixed on the door. Moments later, the Hookman appeared in the doorway, his eyes burning with rage. But before he could take another step, the cashier stepped forward, holding a baseball bat. "Get out of here," he shouted. The Hookman hesitated, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed like he might attack. But then he turned and fled into the night. The cashier sighed in relief, lowering the bat. "Are you two okay?" Yutu and Mary nodded, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. "Thank you," Yutu said, his voice filled with gratitude. The cashier nodded. "Just doing my job. You kids should get home. It's not safe out there." They nodded, still shaken by their encounter. As they made their way home, they couldn't shake the feeling that the Hookman was still out there, watching and waiting for his next victims. The legend of the Hookman was more than just a story. It was a chilling reminder that some urban legends were all too real. The sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow alleyways of Tokyo, a cacophony of hurried paces and distant chatter. Night had fallen, and the city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and neon signs, casting long shadows that danced across the walls of the buildings. Yutu and Mary walked side by side, their hearts still racing from the harrowing encounter with the Hookman at Taka. The city offered a false sense of security, its bustling life, a stark contrast to the haunting silence of the forest. "We need to figure out what to do next," Mary said, her voice trembling slightly. "We can't just ignore what happened." Yutu nodded, his mind racing. "I know. We have to find out more about the Hookman." There has to be a way to stop him. They made their way to a small, dimly lit cafe. Its warm interior a welcome refuge from the cold night air. Inside, they found a corner table and ordered 2 cups of coffee. As they waited, Yuta pulled out his notebook, filled with scribbled notes and sketches about various urban legends. We need to start by understanding the legend better, Yuta said, flipping through the pages. There has to be some clue about how to deal with him. Mary leaned in, her eyes scanning the notes. The legend says he was a fisherman who lost his hand and replaced it with a hook. But why did he become a vengeful spirit? Yuta nodded. That's the key. We need to understand what drives his rage. As they delved deeper into the story, the cafe's door opened and a man in his late 30s walked in. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. He glanced around the room before making his way to their table. Are you Yuto and Mary? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Yuto and Mary exchanged a surprised look. Yes, we are. Who are you? Yuto replied, his curiosity piqued. The man pulled up a chair and sat down. My name is Sato. I'm a journalist. I've been investigating the Hookman legend for years. Yuto's eyes widened in surprise. Really? Do you know how to stop him? Sato nodded slowly. Yes, but it's not going to be easy. The Hookman is a powerful spirit, driven by a deep sense of betrayal and anger. He paused, looking at them intently. To understand how to stop him, you need to know his story. Sato began to recount the tale in a low, steady voice. The Hookman was once a humble fisherman named Takeshi. He lived in a small village by the sea, known for its close-knit community and rich fishing grounds. Takeshi was a kind and hardworking man, loved by all who knew him. But his life took a tragic turn when he lost his hand in a fishing accident. Desperate to continue his work, he fashioned a hook to replace his lost hand. Despite his efforts, the villagers began to see him as a cursed figure, blaming him for their own misfortunes. They ostracized him, driving him into isolation and despair. One stormy night, Takeshi's boat was caught in a fierce storm. He fought valiantly to save it, but the villagers, consumed by their fear and superstition, refused to help. His boat sank, and Takeshi drowned, his heart filled with bitterness and rage. From that moment on, his spirit became the Hookman, a vengeful ghost seeking retribution against those who abandoned him. Yuto and Mare listened in silence, the weight of the story pressing down on them. Is there a way to put his spirit to rest? Mare asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sato nodded. There is. To stop the Hookman, you must confront him and show him the compassion he was denied in life. Only by acknowledging his pain and offering him peace can you hope to end his curse. Yuto and Mary exchanged a determined look. We have to do this, Yuto said, his voice firm. We can't let anyone else suffer because of this. Sato stood up, his expression serious. I'll help you, but you need to be prepared. This won't be an easy task. They spent the next few hours discussing their plan, going over every detail and preparing for the confrontation. As the night wore on, the cafe emptied and the city's bustling. Energy faded into a quiet stillness. Finally, they were ready. The next evening, they returned to meet Takao, their hearts heavy with determination and fear. The forest was just as they remembered it, shrouded in mist and darkness. They followed the same path, their steps careful and deliberate. Yuto carried a small lantern, its flickering light casting eerie shadows on the trees. They reached the abandoned shrine where they had hidden the night before. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness. Sato stepped forward, his eyes scanning the surroundings. This is where we make our stand, he said, his voice steady. We need to draw him out. Yuto nodded, setting the lantern down on the ground. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. Hookman, he called out, his voice echoing through the forest. We know your story. We know your pain. We want to help you find peace. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, The familiar sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Yutu, Mari, and Sato stood their ground, their eyes fixed on the darkness. The Hookman emerged from the shadows, his hook glinting in the lantern's light. His eyes were filled with rage and sorrow, his presence overwhelming. "We're here to help you," Yutu said, his voice shaking but determined. "We understand your pain. We want to give you the peace you deserve." The Hookman paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. "You think you can help me?" He spat, his voice filled with bitterness. "You think you can undo the years of suffering and betrayal?" Mary stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "We can't change the past, but we can offer you forgiveness. We can acknowledge your pain and help you move on." The Hookman hesitated, his hook lowering slightly. For the first time, his expression softened, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sato stepped forward, holding out a small, intricately carved wooden box. "In this box is a token of your past, a reminder of the life you once had. Take it, and let it be a symbol of the peace you seek." The Hookman reached out with his remaining hand, taking the box from Sato. As he opened it, a soft, golden light emanated from within, bathing the forest in a warm glow. The Hookman's expression changed, the anger and bitterness fading away, replaced by a sense of calm and acceptance. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As the light enveloped him, the Hookman's form began to fade, dissolving into the mist. Yutu, Mari, and Sato watched in silence as the spirit found its peace, the forest, returning to its natural state. The curse was lifted, and the legend of the Hookman would no longer haunt the people of Tokyo. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. "We did it," Mari said, her voice filled with relief. Yutu nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, we did." Sato placed a hand on Yutu's shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "You both showed great courage. Takeshi's spirit can finally rest in peace." As they made their way back down the mountain, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a warm glow over the path. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious. The legend of the Hookman finally laid to rest. The city of Tokyo, with its vibrant energy and bustling life, awaited them, a reminder of the resilience and strength that lay within them all. The morning sun cast long, golden rays across the city, illuminating the streets and casting soft shadows over the rooftops. Tokyo was waking up, the sounds of morning traffic and bustling crowds filling the air. Yuto and Mari walked through the busy streets, the events of the previous night still fresh in their minds. Their encounter with the Hookman had left them both shaken, but determined to find a way to end his curse once and for all. "We need to find more information about Takeshi," Yuto said, his voice resolute. "We need to understand what drives his anger if we're going to stop him." Mari nodded in agreement. "Maybe there's something in the old village records. If we can find out more about his past, we might be able to find a way to give him peace." They made their way to the city archives, a large, imposing building filled with dusty tomes and ancient documents. The archivist, an elderly man with a kind smile, greeted them warmly. "How can I help you today?" he asked, his voice gentle. "We're looking for information about a man named Takeshi," Yuto explained. "He was a fisherman who lived in a small village by the sea many years ago." The archivist nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, yes, I believe I remember a story about a fisherman named Takeshi. Let me see what I can find." He led them to a back room, filled with rows of shelves stacked with old records and journals. After a few minutes of searching, he pulled out a dusty ledger and handed it to Yuto. "Here you go. This should have the information you're looking for." Yuto and Mari sat down at a nearby table, the ledger open in front of them. As they turned the pages, they found an entry about Takeshi and his tragic story. It detailed his life as a fisherman, the accident that cost him his hand, and the villagers' cruel treatment of him after the incident. But there was something else, something that hadn't been mentioned in the legend they knew. Take, she had a daughter, Mary said, her voice filled with surprise. She was just a child when he died. Yutu's eyes widened. Maybe she has something to do with his anger. If we can find her, we might be able to understand more. They thanked the archivist and left the building, a new sense of purpose driving them forward. Their next task was to find Takeshi's daughter and learn what they could from her. After some research, they discovered that she had moved to a small town on the outskirts of Tokyo, where she lived a quiet, reclusive life. They traveled to the town, their hearts heavy with anticipation. The journey was long, but they finally arrived at a small, modest house, nestled among tall trees. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the sound of birds chirping. Yuto and Mary approached the door and knocked. After a few moments, an elderly woman opened the door, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and weariness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Are you Takeshi's daughter?" Yuto asked gently. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, I am. Who are you, and why are you here?" Yuto and Mary exchanged a glance before Yuto spoke. "We're here to help your father. His spirit is restless, and we believe you might have the key to giving him peace." The woman's expression softened, and she stepped aside, inviting them in. They sat down in her small living room, the walls adorned with old photographs and memories of a life long past. "Takeshi was a good man," she began, her voice tinged with sadness. "The villagers treated him terribly after his accident. They blamed him for everything that went wrong, and he became a scapegoat for their fears and superstitions." She paused, her eyes distant as she remembered. "But what they didn't know was that my father made a vow before he died. He swore that he would protect me no matter what. Even in death, he couldn't let go of his promise." Mary leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Do you think that's why his spirit is still here? Because he feels he hasn't fulfilled his vow?" The woman nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe so. His love for me was so strong that it bound him to this world, even after his death." Yuto's mind raced. "If we can show him that you're safe and happy, maybe he can find peace." The woman smiled sadly. "I've tried to move on, but the memory of my father's suffering has always haunted me. Perhaps this is the way to finally let go." They spent the next few hours discussing their plan, going over every detail to ensure they were prepared. As night fell, they made their way back to Tokyo. The forest shrouded in darkness once more. The air was thick with tension, the trees casting long, menacing shadows. They reached the abandoned shrine where Takeshi's spirit had first appeared to Yuto and Mary. The woman's presence seemed to bring a sense of calm to the place, her love for her father radiating through the night. "Takeshi," she called out, her voice filled with emotion. "It's me, your daughter. I'm safe, and I've lived a good life. You don't need to protect me anymore." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the familiar sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Takeshi's spirit emerged from the shadows, his hook glinting in the lantern's light. His eyes were filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow, his presence overwhelming. The woman stepped forward, her eyes filled with compassion. "Father, it's time to let go. You don't need to suffer anymore. I'm safe, and I love you." Takeshi's expression softened, the anger and bitterness fading away. His eyes filled with tears, and he reached out with his remaining hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. As the light enveloped him, Takeshi's form began to fade, dissolving into the mist. Yuto, Mary, and the woman watched in silence as his spirit found peace. The forest, returning to its natural state. The curse was lifted, and the legend of the Hookman would no longer haunt the people of Tokyo. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. "We did it," Mary said, her voice filled with relief. Yuto nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "Yeah, we did." The woman placed a hand on Yuto's shoulder, her eyes filled with pride. "You both showed great courage. Takeshi's spirit can finally rest in peace. As they made their way back down the mountain, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a warm glow over the path. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious. The legend of the Hookman finally laid to rest. The city of Tokyo, with its vibrant energy and bustling life, awaited them. A reminder of the resilience and strength that lay within them all. As they walked back into the city, the woman turned to Yuto and Mary. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done. You've given my father peace, and you've given me closure." Yuto smiled, his heart filled with a sense of accomplishment. "We're just glad we could help." They parted ways, the woman returning to her quiet life, and Yuto and Mary returning to their own lives, forever changed by their encounter with the Hookman. The streets of Tokyo bustled with life, the city's vibrant energy, a stark contrast to the dark, haunted forest they had left behind. But in the midst of the city's chaos, they carried with them the memory of their journey, a reminder of the power of compassion and the strength of the human spirit. As the days turned into weeks, Yuto and Mary continued their lives. But the experience had left an indelible mark on their hearts. They had faced their fears, confronted a vengeful spirit, and emerged stronger for it. And though the legend of the Hookman was laid to rest, they knew that there were many more stories waiting to be uncovered, many more spirits in need of peace. Their journey was far from over, but they faced the future with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. They had discovered that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, and that the bonds of love and compassion could overcome even the most powerful of curses. The evening air was thick with humidity. As Yuto and Mary walked through the winding streets of Tokyo, the sun had set, casting long shadows across the ground, and the city lights began to flicker on, one by one. The noise of the bustling city faded into the background as they approached their destination, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building loomed ominously, its dark, decaying structure a stark contrast to the modern skyline behind them. "We sure this is the place?" Mary asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. Yuto nodded, his jaw set in a grim line. "Yes, this is where it all began. This is where we end it." They had spent the past few weeks researching, gathering every piece of information they could find about the Hookman and his curse. Their journey had led them to this moment, the final confrontation with the vengeful spirit that had haunted them. As they stepped inside the warehouse, the air grew colder, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. The interior was a maze of rusted machinery and broken crates, the remnants of a once thriving business now forgotten and forsaken. Yuto switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "We need to find the exact spot where he died," he said, his voice echoing through the empty space. They moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dripping water. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a large, empty space in the center of the warehouse. "This is it," Yuto said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady. Despite the fear that gripped her heart, Yuto nodded, his grip tightening on the small, carved wooden box they had brought with them. The box contained a relic from Takeshi's past, a symbol of the life he had once lived and the peace he sought in death. "Hookman," Yuto called out, his voice strong and commanding. "We know your story. We know your pain. We're here to give you the peace you deserve." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the familiar sound of metal scraping against metal filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The Hookman emerged from the shadows, his hook glinting in the flashlight's beam. His eyes burned with rage and sorrow, his presence overwhelming. Yuto and Mary stood their ground, their hearts pounding with fear. "We brought something for you," Yuto said, holding up the wooden box. "It's a piece of your past, a reminder of the life you once had." The Hookman paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. You think this will change anything? He spat, his voice filled with bitterness. We believe it will, Mary said, her voice calm and compassionate. We believe you deserve peace, and we're here to help you find it. The Hookman's expression softened slightly, the anger and bitterness fading away. He reached out with his remaining hand, taking the box from Yutu. As he opened it, a soft golden light emanated from within, bathing the warehouse in a warm glow. The Hookman's eyes filled with tears, and he looked up at Yutu and Mary, his expression one of gratitude and relief. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with emotion. As the light enveloped him, the Hookman's form began to fade, dissolving into the mist. Yutu and Mary watched in silence as his spirit found peace, the warehouse returning to its natural state. The curse was lifted, and the legend of the Hookman would no longer haunt the people of Tokyo. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. We did it, Mary said, her voice filled with relief. Yutu nodded, a smile breaking across his face. Yeah, we did. As they made their way out of the warehouse, the first light of dawn began to break through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious. The legend of the Hookman finally laid to rest. The city of Tokyo, with its vibrant energy and bustling life, awaited them. A reminder of the resilience and strength that lay within them all. As they walked back into the city, Yuta turned to Mary. We should document this. People need to know what happened. And they need to know that even the darkest legends can be overcome. Mary nodded, her eyes filled with determination. Agreed. This is a story that needs to be told. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, writing down every detail of their journey, from their initial encounter with the Hookman to the final confrontation. Their story was published in a local newspaper, and it quickly gained attention, spreading throughout Tokyo and beyond. People were fascinated by the tale of the Hookman and the courage of Yuto and Mary. Their story became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even the darkest of legends could be confronted and overcome. As the weeks turned into months, Yuto and Mary continued their lives, forever changed by their experience. They remained close friends, their bond strengthened by the trials they had faced together. And though the legend of the Hookman was laid to rest, they knew that there were many more stories waiting to be uncovered, many more spirits in need of peace. Their journey was far from over, but they faced the future with a newfound sense of purpose and determination. They had discovered that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, and that the bonds of love and compassion could overcome even the most powerful of curses. The city of Tokyo, with its vibrant energy and bustling life, continued to thrive, its people living their lives with a newfound sense of courage and resilience. Yuto and Mary's story became a part of the city's rich tapestry of legends, a reminder of the strength that lay within each and every one of them. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the ground, Yuto and Mary stood together, looking out over the skyline. We did something good here, Yuto said, his voice filled with pride. Mary nodded, a smile spreading across her face. Yes, we did. And there's still so much more to do. They turned away from the cityscape, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their journey had only just begun, but they knew that together they could overcome anything. As they walked into the night, the sounds of the city faded into the background, and the stars began to twinkle overhead. The legend of the Hookman was laid to rest, but the spirit of courage and resilience that Yuto and Mary embodied would live on, inspiring others to face their fears and find their own paths to peace.